Hey, am I recording a video?
In the decades since the end of the King-led civil rights movement, a common narrative has emerged, one that overlooks the ideological structure of the protest and instead redefines those protests as peaceful and nonviolent. They also view these protests as defensive or passive, but that really was never the intent. In fact, the intent of these movements was to provoke violence. That by peacefully protesting, it was the intent of civil rights activists to create a violent response from the police or from the power structure that was being protested. In fact, the 1963 Birmingham movement had as its specific purpose to agitate the head of the Public Safety Commission, Bull Connor, into reacting violently against protesters. And farther from respecting police or city ordinances, activists like King were arrested dozens of times for disobeying the police or breaking city ordinances or other local laws in the practice and participation in these marches. This narrative relies on a happy outcome mythology that positions the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act or affirmative action as the end of discrimination in America and proves that there really weren't that many racists in America and the system wasn't riddled with racism. But it does miss that even to contemporaries of King, he was perceived as creating violence in his protests. The fact is that King chose nonviolence not simply because it was the moral choice, but also because it was the practical choice.
Nonviolence is also practically sound. We are about 10 or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower, so it would just be totally impractical.
King and other activists were convinced that the only way to demonstrate to America the violence that underlay segregation was to evoke violence by the police to peaceful protests.
I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
King and other activists recognized that they were protesting against government oppression that was enforced by police, and the only way to make that oppression visible was to create, for cameras, police brutality and police violence.
Realism impels me to admit, however, that when there is justice and the pursuit of justice, violence disappears, and where there is injustice and frustration, the potentialities for violence are greater.
Even as King resisted calls for aggressive or violent demonstrations, he rejected the idea that black anger or violence towards the system wasn't understandable or justifiable.
And I contend that the cry of black power is at bottom a reaction to the reluctance of white power to make the kind of changes necessary to make justice a reality for the Negro. I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard.
But King's justification and understanding of violence and frustration in the movement have been largely rewritten. This is likely because it's easier to presume that white people willingly gave up discrimination, and legislation like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act made everything equal. And this has allowed white politicians, citizens, and journalists to resist dissent from groups that question the political, economic, or social order that underlay systemic racism. And any protest that questions the authoritative structure of America has traditionally been labeled unpatriotic.
Police brutality. There's people being murdered unjustly and not being held accountable. Cops are getting paid leave for killing people. That's not right. That's not right by anyone's standards.
Get that son of a off the field right now. Out. He's fired. But if you're not happy in the U.S., if you're complaining all the time, very simply, you can leave. You can leave right now.
Yes. I think that he went about it the wrong way. I don't think he understands.
What is the right way? When people say that, I'm always fascinated. What is the right way?
Here's the deal.
So here's a black man in America who says, I don't know how to get a message across. If I march in the streets, people say I'm a thug. If I go out and I protest, people say that it's a riot. If I bend down on one knee, then it's not. What is the right way? That is something I've always wanted to know. What is the right way for a black person to get attention in America?
King to many Americans at the time was also labeled as un-American and unpatriotic.
Dr. King, the columnists Evans and Novak recently charged that the moderate Negro leaders, including you, have feared to point out the degree of communist infiltration in the civil rights movement. Have communists infiltrated the movement? The AP reported the other day that a picture of you taken in 1957 at a Tennessee interracial school is being plastered all over Alabama billboards with the caption, Martin Luther King at a communist training school. Will you tell us whether that was a communist training school and what you were doing there?
This interview wasn't an aberration. King was not a communist, but this was an easy point of attack. This, for the 1950s and 1960s, was the un-American attack, to call somebody a communist in the middle of the Cold War. What this questioning did reveal was that despite the mythology of the great king who had led America to an anti-discriminatory pinnacle, his movement was losing support. Public support following the 1963 televised brutality of police with dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham was the high watermark of public approval of the protests. From there to the end of the 1960s, King found his support slowly eroding and found himself consistently answering in interviews why that was the case.
People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
The white backlash is nothing new. It is the surfacing of old prejudices, hostilities, and ambivalences that have always been there.
As King points out, white people were alarmed by the violence of police, but they weren't ready to go the next step to undo the system that had created that violence. Conservatives and Americans generally overlook the white backlash to these protests that led to the assassination of King and 40 other civil rights leaders, and instead focus on those happy outcomes and then declare victory. But the reality is that people in the 1960s were not ready to take the civil rights movement much farther than superficial legislation. Therefore, conservatives and Americans generally have diminished King's rhetoric down to nothing more than he wanted to get rid of segregation and eliminate obvious color barriers to black advancement, which has been boiled down to a few lines in the famous I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Clinging to this line gives conservatives justification for doing nothing. It is also a weapon against those minority groups that seek redress. The mythology is then used to white-splain King to contemporary activists.
All my life, I've been inspired by the example of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But what I see in the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement is a political agenda of the radical left that would defund the police, that would
leave that out of it, just
tear
the
down
phrase.
monuments, that would press a radical left agenda that and support calls for the kind of violence that has beset the very communities that they say that they're advocating for.
This rewriting of the civil rights struggle is designed to give white people to be annoyed or opposed to the demands of contemporary civil rights movements. However, King was a radical to people in the 60s and conservatives today. He didn't simply call for the inclusion of people of color into the economic systems of America. Instead, he questioned those systems and the ways that they oppressed minorities and the poor in America and around the world. These problems, according to King,
cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. So what we must all see is that these are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation, and out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the earth are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions. It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. This has driven many to feel that only Marxism has the revolutionary spirit.
King rejected conservatives' resistance to remedying past discrimination and exploitation of African Americans. King claimed that America was hypocritical for rejecting directly aiding blacks, while it had traditionally given handouts to whites and the wealthy.
To those staunch Republicans and Democrats of the Midwest and West who were given land by our government when they came here as immigrants from Europe, they were given education through the land-grant colleges. They were provided with agricultural agents to keep them abreast of farming trends. They were granted low-interest loans to aid in the mechanization of their farms. And now that they have succeeded in becoming successful, they are paid not to farm. And these are the same people who now say to black people whose ancestors were brought to this country in chains and who were emancipated in 1863 without being given land to cultivate or bread to eat, that they must pull themselves up by their own bootstraps.
King also questioned conservative economics and its exploitation of workers.
We cry out against welfare handouts to the poor, but generously approve an oil depletion allowance to make the rich richer. 6 Mississippi plantations receive more than $1 million a year not to plant cotton, but no provision is made to feed the tenant farmer who is put out of work by the government subsidy. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves. And continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad.
King rejected the idea that nothing could be done, and instead he stated that A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro.
The problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. We must further recognize that the ghetto is a domestic colony. Black people must develop programs that will aid in the transfer of power and wealth into the hands of residents of the ghetto so that they may in reality control their own destinies. The way to end poverty is to end the exploitation of the poor, ensure them a fair share of the government services and the nation's resources. I proposed recently that a national agency be established to provide employment for everyone needing it.
The conservative rewriting of King's agenda is the result of economic or white privilege and the threat that changing the system might have on that very privilege. Rewriting the King narrative has been used to limit protests by claiming King never would have wanted this. Rewriting King is nothing more than a conscious or subconscious reaction to true equality, because that might mean a restriction or loss of privilege. So we must remember that nonviolence did not intend to be nonviolent and passive. It intended to provoke violence. It intended to create crisis and tension as the only mechanism to creating real change. That it was seen that making visible the oppression through police and governmental brutality was the point. That was the only path to creating equality. But we also must remember, too, that simply breaking down barriers of color were not enough to King or anybody else in this movement. That's a systemic, economic, political, and social change also had to accompany that reassessment of American society.